Thanks to everyone who has joined us. We're going to give it just a minute or two more to let others come in, and then we'll start. All right, I think we're going to get underway. Huge thanks for joining us, and happy Pride Month. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I lead the California Natural Resources Agency. Many of you may know us or even be part of our agency. We're a big, broad environmental agency encompassing 25,000 people across our state, focused on stewarding our natural environment. And so really proud to do that work and to do it with such an incredible, diverse array of folks truly across the state. Many of you may have joined for a speaker series before, but I just want to share a little bit about these dialogues. They're really an effort to build a conversation, bring in leaders and big thinkers, and lift up priorities across our agency. One of our key priorities and values across the agency is just to celebrate this incredible diversity we have within our agency and state government, but really all of California. And so each month in these different heritage months, we lift up different members of our community and different communities we have within our broad family. And so this month is of course Pride, and we are really excited to be convening different ways, different opportunities to celebrate. We started the month with a service project in the Bay Area in Richmond. We're of course having this dialogue with leaders from the LGBTQ plus community here today. And then this weekend, many of us will be marching in the Sacramento Pride Parade. Really excited to report that with our sister agency, California Environmental Protection Agency, our agency will be marching in the Pride Parade for the second straight year. It was definitely a highlight for my family last year, and looking forward to it again this year. So just to share a little bit more before we introduce our panelists and get into our conversation, just share a little bit more about ways that we try to make these discussions as interactive as possible. My colleague, Geeta Chandra, who deserves credit for organizing this discussion, is staffing the chat function within your platform. So if you can open up your chat function, she's going to provide different links on our speakers and their organizations or different topics that come up throughout the conversation. You can also at any point in the conversation press your Q&A button, and you can ask the panelists a question or share an observation. We'll see those, and sometimes we're able to respond to you directly via the keyboard, or oftentimes I bring those into conversations when we get our panelists together at the end for a group discussion. We're recording this session, so this will be available that you can check out on our website about a day after it takes place. So at some point late tomorrow, you can go onto our website and we'll have a recording that includes all of the information that was provided in the chat. So really excited to welcome you to this discussion, and maybe even more excited to share with you who we have with us today. We have a great set of leaders from really diverse sectors, some who work in our agency, some who don't, to share their experience as members of the LGBTQ plus community and how it's informed their work. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. The first person I get to introduce is my colleague and friend, Caroline Thomas Jacobs. Caroline represents the newest entity, or leads, I should say, the newest entity within the California Natural Resources Agency, and that's the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. And Caroline, you built this entire entity, which is really focused on reducing wildfire risks from our electric utilities. You built this all during the pandemic, remarkably. So first of all, huge thanks for the work that you do. You're hovering in front of the office building that we share here in Sacramento. First of all, thank you for the work you do, and welcome to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Wade. Really appreciate getting the chance to be here today and talk about this issue.
Yeah. So you're now leading this entity in state government focused on infrastructure safety and wildfire safety. You came from the California Office of Emergency Services, Cal OES, sort of statewide FEMA. I'm interested in this upward trajectory of public leadership that you've had. How has your experience as a member of the LGBTQ plus community impacted your career, and how does it shape your work, in a day-to-day or week-to-week?
Well, I really appreciate the question, and it was interesting, getting to sort of sit with this a little bit and get ready for this panel, because I haven't really taken the time necessarily to look back over the 30 years and specifically think about that, right? So it was a great opportunity for me to do that reflection. And interestingly, upon that reflection, I realized that my queer identity has influenced all of my career. My queer identity has influenced all of my career and professional identity, starting with, what even jobs I imagined were possible for me. So, just quick trajectory, came out at 19 in college. At the time, I was actually really interested in working for the FBI. But once I came out, I realized that at the time, security clearances weren't given to queer people because they figured we were a threat, right? So you had to sort of lie on your security clearance to be able to even get the job, which was ironic. I was out, so I wasn't able to do that. So that was kind of off the table. Then I was thinking about academia and really wanted to go into academia. And then I thought about that I knew I wanted to have a queer family. And at the time, there were only a few places that were really safe to do so. So I rooted myself in California, in the East Bay of the Bay Area of California at the time, late 90s this was. And so my queer identity sort of placed me in terms of what professional options were open to me and the place that I wanted to surround myself, the state and the community I wanted to surround myself in. And throughout that process, it's interesting, I realized that it was my gender expression that actually, once I was placed in my workplace and my career, I ended up in the tech sector initially here in the Bay Area. It was my gender expression that really kind of informed how I moved through that workplace, because I had to, really think critically and deeply about how I presented myself and how that might impact my opportunities in terms of developing relationships with my colleagues and, my superiors and the community that I was in. And put really directly and frankly, 25 years ago, wearing a tie in the workplace, that would have been disruptive. That would have been disruptive to that. And so it wasn't something that I necessarily did. Obviously have always been masculine presenting, but not wearing a tie. Like, to me, that was a big step. So fast forward, and I'll get to sort of how it influences my leadership in our current department. It was actually once I got to the PUC and was, the world had been evolving and changing around how it understood and discussed gender expression. And I was in a more, frankly, senior position. So the threat was a little bit less because I was in a more senior position and was surrounded by colleagues that I knew and had faith that it wasn't going to become an issue. And so was able to, in my career for the first time, be able to, sort of present myself in my fullest self. And how has that impacted my role in leadership of building the department? It's been it directly impacts it, because I think really deeply about when we're building up the department and the culture that we want to bring to energy safety and what we do and how we think about executing our mission as a state regulatory body that influences a lot in the energy sector. I want to make sure that it's our people that do that. So I want to make sure that we bring and we build energy safety in such a way that all of our people can express themselves in their fullest self and thrive within our department so that we can do the good work for the rest of the state, the residents of the state. And it also And it influences not just the culture we want to create internally in the workplace, but also how we think about the work that we do for the state of California. So for our world is utility regulation, wildfire safety. So a specific way that we are thinking about how we make sure that we can ensure that our communities thrive is thinking about how wildfire safety, the consequences of wildfire risk, can have different impacts and different consequences on disadvantaged communities. So we really think through how do we make sure that when we're influencing the way electrical corporations invest billions of dollars across the state of California, that they're not perpetuating what we all now know has been historical inequities in how the infrastructure environment has been built around us in our communities, and that our regulatory influence can, as much as possible, avoid those continuation of those inequities within the energy space. So it's been my queer identity has been deeply impactful to my own personal professional experience and the workplace. But I really try to bring that also to how we build up the department for the state of California and then ultimately execute our mission.
That's incredible. And huge thanks for your courage and being that sort of pathway maker for others, and bringing your authentic self to work, and then being a leader that does that, I think is incredibly powerful. You know, the theme last year for our Pride celebrations was be yourself, change the world. And when we allow people to bring their full selves to work, I think we can get that much more done together. I'll also just reflect on your personal history in basing yourself in California, because that has been a safer place for queer folks. And I woke up on June 1st and I was so excited because I went on my Twitter, like you and I sometimes do, first thing in the morning. I refuse to call it X. I'm still calling it Twitter. And I saw just all of these statements from California leaders on Happy Pride. Our governor, of course, and state leaders. And I love this one from the leader of the state Senate, Mike McGuire. And he said, no matter your background, no matter your skin color, who you are, who you love, or how you identify, California loves you. Happy Pride. And I thought, how incredible, state elected officials, the first thing that they're doing is as affirming a statement as that. So I think we can be proud of this in California, Caroline, but also recognize that this journey continues and that not everybody works in a workplace that is this open and affirming. What's your take in terms of, where we're at on that journey, either in state government in California, and what advice would you have to leaders, be they queer or not, in terms of creating a workplace where people can really bring their authentic selves?
Yeah, so I mean, it is really unfortunate. There's so much progress has been made, right? And yet there's been, over the last few years, a bit of I would say, a swing back, right? And so I think we have to be at the vigilance. We really need to be vigilant on. It took a lot of work and a lot of focus on making all the progress that we have had, and we need to make sure that we don't lose that focus. It's something I talk a lot about actually with my kids, right? My kids, they grew up in, we live right next to Berkeley, right? So in this very progressive place where that's just norms for them. And I really talk a lot about with them that it's really important for us to recognize that we need to keep fighting and we need to keep that presence. And visibility matters. I mean, to your point, visibility matters. So as leaders, what do we need, some of the challenges and what can we do? I think back on, there was one experience I had when I worked in the tech sector that actually has been very impactful in terms of how I have approached leadership and my role. So when I was at Apple, I worked at Apple in the Apple retail group. And in 2004, Apple was launching the iPod minis, the first iPod mini, and it came in 5 colors. All the Apple retail cut a deal with Nike to get custom shoes for all the retail employees across the stores worldwide. So it was going to be on the feet of thousands of retail employees. They wanted to surprise the employees though with this shoe. So they did a survey, and surreptitiously in the survey said, what's your favorite color, iPod mini color, right? The idea being they were going to make the swish, the Nike swish on the shoe, the favorite color, right? Well, I was in the senior leadership meeting of the Apple retail group, and the head of ops was like, hey, by the way, about 100 or so men said pink. I know they didn't really mean to say pink, so we're going to switch all those to gray because we don't want them to ask us to replace the shoes because clearly they're not going to want to wear Nike shoes with a pink switch. And I was like, wait, what? So I spoke up and said, I'm not sure that's the message we want to send. Like what you're making a lot of assumptions here around gender, right? Gender identity and stuff. Long story short, it was me and the one other queer person in the room that spoke up and kind of called out this like underlying message around gender expression that was clearly wrong at the time. No one else jumped in there, but the leader, the Apple retail leader, senior leader, to his credit, did make the choice not to change it, right? Because I was like, you're sending a message around culture. You're sending a message to all those Apple employees that it was wrong to choose pink for the men, right? Anyway, so he changed the decision. They didn't change the shoes. No, not a single person ever asked to replace their shoes. The men wore the shoes with pink. It was no big deal. But what I took away from that experience was, in terms of what do we need to go forward as leaders, is I recognized a couple things. One, I actually was coming from a place of privilege to be able to speak up there as a white person, as a class privileged person at the time, that I was taking risk, but I was only taking so much risk. So I think it's really important for us to recognize our individual roles in being able to speak up. And then two, allies support and speak up as well, right? To be able to create that support, to be able to keep progress going. And leaders make the cultural decision. What kind of culture do you want? Not the operational expediency, save money on maybe not having to replace a pair of shoes, right? But it's about the culture that we want to create in the departments and the organizations that we're in. And it's going to take all of us to be able to keep moving that culture forward in terms of acceptance and diversity.
It's so true. We all have a role, regardless of where we're at within our organizations. It's so true. Caroline, thank you so much for everything you're doing and sharing your story, and looking forward to getting you back in the group conversation. Next, we're going to introduce Dr. Michael Mendez. I have known Professor Mendez for a long time, when you were in Sacramento working in state government, and now Dr. Mendez is at the University of California, Irvine, where he serves as an assistant professor and the Andrew Carnegie Fellow. And Dr. Mendez, or Michael, if I can call you that, you do groundbreaking work on climate change and equity. And so huge thanks for everything that you're doing for the climate movement and building more equitable California. I'm interested, given that it's Pride and given this discussion, just to reflect on your journey as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and how it informs your work in academia and how you live your life.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Secretary and Gita and other staff at the Natural Resources Agency for thinking about this, about ensuring that LGBTQ people are centered in this time of great pride around LGBTQ rights and civil rights, and more importantly, how that intersects with environmental issues. So this talk really made me think back about where we have come in terms of LGBTQ rights, responsibilities, civil rights relating to environmental issues. I think back on when I was a faculty fellow at the Yale School of Environment, arguably one of the best environmental schools in the world. And at that time, there was very little talk and focus on how LGBTQ people are being disproportionately impacted from climate-induced disasters and other types of climatic events. And students would come up to me and feel like an unwelcoming environment going to an elite school like that, and didn't see themselves fitting into that sort of frame of environmentalism. So I had a great student, Leo Goldsmith, who in one of my courses did an excellent graduate paper on looking at that very issue and intersection of climate change, induced disasters, and LGBTQ people. And we had workshops based on his paper and started to think more systematically on how we could really put center LGBTQ people. Because again, back in 2019, this issue was very niche. It was largely rendered invisible in academia, and most importantly, in the environmental policymaking world. So we sought to really focus on dispelling this myth of white gay affluence and how, when you think about LGBTQ people, so oftentimes you think of very wealthy, fashionable, cis gay men that have all the wealth in the world to protect themselves from these climactic events. But through our research, we really showed how that LGBTQ people of color, particularly African American, transgender people, Latino, LGBTQ people, are some of the most impacted people when a disaster does strike, because the very same individuals or demographics that you use to assess social vulnerability, language barriers, low income status, race, being unhoused, is very present in the LGBTQ population, but that's not really talked about. So when I think of myself as an LGBTQ scholar and expert in the policy realm as well, and when I started to endeavor with my student, now colleague Leo, it was sort of a second coming out for me professionally. Everyone knew I was gay, but to enter that realm, put my name, my credibility, part of my research agenda on this issue that many people found to be controversial, because this, again, was not California, and we were looking at national levels, was an amazing process. Oftentimes, maybe a scary process at first, but I was really happy to be able to work with some other emerging scholars like Leo and Vanessa Raditz that are LGBTQ as well, and putting forward this. And together we have worked on like the National Climate Assessment, which many of you may know is the premier congressionally mandated report that the United States puts out on climate impacts nationally and throughout the region. And within that, we were able to, for the very first time, include language that LGBTQ people, based on data that we had and others have derived, are a socially vulnerable population and need to have a stronger environmental justice lens. So I'm really proud of that, and looking at my trajectory for a couple of years ago, before we had even this summer of racial reckoning in 2020 and George Floyd, it's focusing on LGBTQ people of color in the policymaking, climate change policy, and in the climate science and academic world as well. So I know they put some links into the chat of some recent research that I did with my colleagues, and I look forward to talking a little bit more about that. It includes newspaper articles from NPR, as well as a citation from the New York Times on how LGBTQ people are being disproportionately displaced by climate-induced disasters, and at some levels at 4 times the rate of non-LGBTQ people. So happy to talk more about that, and look forward to our discussion.
That's incredible. One of the things I love about these jobs is our ability to continue to learn. And, you know, I am not up to speed on this disparate impact. And so it's, you know, thank you for outlining that for us. And as you say, Geeta's got 4 or more great links that can educate us. Maybe just a quick question for you as an LGBTQ, you know, leader in academics. How do you feel like has been the evolution of being, you know, like a queer scholar, and has that impacted your trajectory, and where do you think we sit today?
That's an interesting question. It depends what time of the day you ask me, but definitely being a community engaged scholar, or some people might call that a scholar activist. You know, I know they're similar, but they're very different things. I generally call myself a community engaged scholar because I work with community groups, undocumented migrants, Latino organizations, indigenous migrants as well, and of course the overlap with LGBTQ communities. It was a tough road at first, and I definitely think that there's some spaces that are not welcoming of these type of issues. It makes people uncomfortable. For example, the LA Times today had a poll for Pride Month saying that never before has the majority of Americans, U.S. Americans, supported LGBTQ communities. But if you dig a little bit deeper into the results, it's very much less so for transgender people.
Yeah.
So when we put forward this intersectional environmental justice lens and particularly focus on transgender people, I think that in some circles that may make people uncomfortable, but I at least I don't try to shy away from that. My other line of research after my book has been looking at climate-induced disaster to undocumented Latino and indigenous migrants, another group that's highly stigmatized and marginalized in our society. So on both ends of doing non-LGBTQ work and doing the undocumented migrant work, I definitely think that, there's opportunity to grow, but I am supportive of the elected officials and appointed officials that we have here in California that are trying to become a beacon of light and hope for the rest of the United States. For example, California State Senator Badia has a bill, Senate Bill 990, that takes some of our data on disaster displacement, and I believe it passed the Senate already, and it's requiring the Cal OES, our state emergency office, to update its plans and do outreach with LGBTQ nonprofits and organizations to ensure that disaster policy no longer renders the LGBTQ community, and also, most importantly, some of the most marginalized LGBTQ communities, LGBT youth that's homeless, Latinos that get kicked out of their home and become homeless because of cultural and religious issues, and people in general that are low income. So
Wow.
I really grateful for that type of leadership for this event, and then for that legislation that hopefully makes it all the way to the governor's desk.
And huge thanks for connecting those dots. And then Geeta, if you can find the link to that LA Times article, that's actually, I think that's the featured article on the LA Times website, and fascinating poll that Dr. Mendez just referenced. So huge thanks for the conversation. We'll bring you back into the group discussion. The connection between environment and climate change and health has never been more apparent as we persist through this extreme heat wave in California that impacts economically, socially vulnerable people much more. And so I'm really proud and thankful that we're next joined by Dr. Jason Gritty. And Dr. Gritty, or Jason, is a medical leader at Kaiser Permanente. He serves as Assistant Chief of Adult and Family Medicine at South Sacramento. And Dr. Gritty, huge thanks for joining us. That is an incredible pride background that you have for Kaiser. And talk to us, if you would, about being a doctor, being a leader of a hospital who is also a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and how it informs the work, and what should we be thinking about, and what should we be learning around on this intersection around inclusivity and acceptance and medical care?
Great question, and thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this panel. Some amazing speakers that we have today, so I'm honored to be a part of this group. I think what I would say is that part of what drove me to a position of leadership is how I grew up. I ended up graduating high school in Manhattan, Kansas, and I'll just say that was not a great community for LGBT plus. It was a very, very difficult experience coming out in that kind of environment. There was actually 2 of my friends that committed suicide in high school, which was very hard. I almost followed them, suffered from depression for many years, constantly dealing with a lot of attacks, and still triggers me a little bit. But looking back at that, I realized that I escaped and I survived. And so I wanted to make sure that I have a conscious decision to live openly, authentically, despite some of the adversity that we do face when we're out LGBT people. When I interviewed, finishing residency in medical school, some of the places I did interview, when I introduced my husband that I brought with, I was actually actively told that this is probably not a good place for you. You should look somewhere else. I chose California for multiple reasons. One, it is a beautiful blue state. There's amazing outdoor space. I love being in the outdoors. I love all of the opportunities that California has. and I'm not afraid to be my authentic self in California. So I do have, obviously, as many people have been mentioning, there's a lot of intersectionality here. And as a white cisgendered male, and my pronouns are he, him, and his, I approach things from a limited viewpoint. And so I strive definitely to recognize that even though I might have the best of intentions, we all have unconscious bias. And I want to make sure that we're raising the awareness of those biases for the people in our community that are extremely at risk. So ultimately, my goal is to be a compassionate, knowledgeable provider and use my voice to help the marginalized community to get more equitable healthcare. The second part of your question is where do we go from here, and how do we improve addressing some of these healthcare disparities? Really quickly, I would say there's a lot of different opportunities for more cultural competency training. A lot of our providers, I will tell you, in residency, very few residency programs include anything about LGBT care. And so there's a lot of gaps in knowledge for most of our providers, and there are some unique needs for this community. So cultural competency training, but also really pushing for our medical schools and residency programs to include this aspect of training for our doctors that are already in the field practicing, really just kind of encouraging more additional training and requesting that there be providers that are accessible with knowledge. Many people go through additional training, for example, with the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or the WPATH training, that really provides a lot of outstanding training for the most marginalized part of our community. Thankfully, we live in this state, and I work for Kaiser Permanente, and there's a lot of existing anti-discrimination policies. And when I came out at work, they were like, oh, that's great. I think we're going to mentor you with this chief of this other department. Him and his partner are really nice, and they can kind of welcome you to the area and the community. And nobody batted an eye. And so that was really reaffirming. And so we have onboarding processes now for our doctors where we offer this kind of training. I work with a couple of my colleagues at Sutter and other areas in the local LGBT center. I'm the volunteer medical director there. Dr. Spiegel also volunteers in the Transgender Health Center. And we work to really kind of connect some of the patients that can fall between the insurances and go back and forth. So I think there needs to be more work with some of the local communities, as mentioned previously, to really help some of the more marginalized group have access to care. Access to gender affirming care is a very specific niche. I think we do really good in California, but as everybody's aware, there's a lot of laws that have been changed. There's hundreds of laws that have been introduced across the country, really attacking these very vulnerable groups. And when you have groups like this that end up often thrown out of the house, very housing insecure, often underemployed, underinsured, they have the highest risk and they have the highest vulnerabilities. And some of these groups actually have suicide rates of more than 60%. And so we really need to be doing a better job at being available for those communities. So mental health support is a huge one. And thankfully, California has really stepped up and kind of held some of our organizations really accountable for being able to provide better access to mental health support, including for this community. And you know, this is California. I'm sure there's people on here that have, you know, experienced or remember the AIDS epidemic and all the people that did die from HIV and AIDS. And thankfully now we have treatments and prevention for that. So access to sexual health services, including, you know, HIV prophylaxis, doxypep, and others, is essential to make sure we're not going to create another wave of infected individuals. In fact, just wanted to mention that the fastest growing group of HIV positive individuals are our LGBT youth, and particularly the minority youth are at the highest risk of growing in the HIV population. So education, prevention, and access is absolutely essential. I love that your organization is doing community outreach. I will be marching on the Pride Parade with the Kaiser contingent to let people see that there are healthcare providers that are out there. There are people that are not going to judge you and give you that access to care that you need and that you deserve. And the main reason I really would reinforce that is when I first started out here, I can't tell you the number of patients that started to cry when they walked into my office and saw that I had some, rainbow paraphernalia. I had my buttons, and we have ally information. All my medical assistants and nurses are trained that way. And they actually had to say, this is the first time in 2 decades that I've been feeling safe enough to be my authentic self. And we truly can't give good care if we don't know who you are and what your needs are. So you have to be safe in that healthcare space. I do think we're doing a good job, but we could do better.
That's incredible and really moving. And, 2 points that come to mind. One is, even though I think we can be proud of what we've done collectively across California to create, inclusive systems, inclusive culture, there's more work to be done, because no doubt there are folks within the communities that are not getting the healthcare that they need. I mean, they're marginalized based on their identity or orientation. And then second, what point Caroline made, which is it's not like you achieve a certain progress and then it's guaranteed, there's always work to be done. And so our governor talks a lot about California needs to be a model, but we need to maintain vigilance to protect that, because it is under attack. The very icon of the rainbow flag is no longer being flown in some communities that are trying to ban it. So it's just a great understanding, or a great reminder of this work is constant. But huge thanks for the work that you do. And Geeta put in the chat some alarming health disparities that are correlated with orientation and identity. And so just thanks, Dr. Gritty, for giving us a sense. I think as a member of Kaiser Permanente, I'm going to go in and next time I'm in and notice the organization differently. So huge thanks there. Get you back into the group conversation in just a little bit.
Science program, science funding efforts for applied research designed to inform the management of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, ensuring that the best available science really underlies our environmental management decisions. I know I look really young, but I've been here for almost 9 years, actually. I guess one of the perks of being trans. For me, it is just really important for me to feel safe enough to be able to bring my full authentic self into the workplace. Before coming out as trans in 2017, I looked around and I didn't see anyone like me or like who I needed to become. And so that really manifested as like a paralyzing uncertainty situation. I was scared of losing my job. I was scared of losing the trust and relationships in the workplace that I had been building early in my career. It's scary to think about losing that. And I know that to some people, it might seem ideal for a workplace to be strictly professional and like sterilized of personal information. But when I came out, I didn't have any empirical evidence that it was going to be okay. My gender identity was not represented in any way. Government documents, you always see he or she, him or her in those documents. And then colleagues, where I just didn't see any other trans people. And what I did see was a little section on the workplace discrimination poster in the break room. And so when I was struggling with depression and thinking about coming out, that's what I would cling to for hope. I was also in a great Kaiser support group at the time. Big shout out to Kaiser. And the problem with that too is I heard a lot of, horror stories about people coming out and challenges with employment and, not conforming to the gender binary. And so I knew it was going to be probably a not smooth transition for me at work. And so, in fact, there was some pushback when I needed to change my name and gender at work. But there was some trans sensitivity training that was brought in for my coworkers. And most of my colleagues really reacted in a very affirming way. I just didn't know how they would react, right? And so for me, that really underscores the benefits of training. And I've also found that my scientist colleagues are really my community, especially the LGBTQIA plus folks. But I do want to say, though, that like recently, if you're a state worker, with your mandated sexual harassment prevention training that's required, I'm just super glad to see that the training now includes trans stories. that definitely trigger me from my experiences, but nevertheless are needed. And I also think, working on inclusive language is something that we should really be focusing on. And I was, before I came out, I was expecting discrimination, and I was expecting that I would probably lose my 7-year marriage, and both of those actually came true. But I've also been very privileged. I have allies at work, family and friends that have supported me through tough times. And I've had excellent mental and physical care through Kaiser Permanente, which I'm super grateful for. But I know that really starkly contrasts against so many other transgender people out there. Transgender people of color and trans feminine people in particular experience a whole nother level of discrimination and lack of access to resources. And then with new laws that are like, Dr. Goody mentioned, the new laws that are targeting LGBTQ people, especially trans people, gender affirming care really being restricted, and violence against trans people really surging across the world. Community is really more important than ever. There was a survey in 2021 that found, I'll end with a statistic here, 6.6% of the US population identifies as transgender. And so statistically, that's really not a lot, but it does mean that we're not alone. So thanks.
Well, huge thanks for sharing your story and just for your general leadership and your courage. So important. The work that you do and sharing this for others. We have, over 160 people joining us in the discussion today. And many may be allies, and many are allies. And so I guess one open question for you would be, knowing what you do about the workplace and just the tremendous challenge of coming out as trans, what direction or what guidance can you give to those who are not trans but want to create a workplace where that would be that folks can be their authentic selves as transgender people? Like, is there what can we take away from this in building our own inclusive workplace?
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate that you care about this issue and the platform here. I mean, like I said, I think encouraging people to bring their full selves to work. I know it doesn't always seem like it takes extra time, and you could get into things that are uncomfortable. But I think it's really important to have those relationships at work that are strong. They're stronger when you bring everything about you to work. And I think one of my colleagues that moved to DWR, he's doing a great job of putting out rainbow, stickers and posters, and just like being very welcoming, having signs that say, I'm an ally. And that just, I can't imagine what that would have been like to me, like that, trying to come out and seeing things like that would have been just changing everything. So
yeah, visibility matters, right?
Visibility matters, exactly.
Yeah. And sometimes people, my journey in this is some people saying, well, of course, I don't discriminate, or we don't have a discriminatory workplace. Well, that's a baseline. But then if we're going to be open and affirming, we have to basically communicate that, so that people, feel comfortable. So it's a journey for us, but I'm so glad you're a leader here in the agency, and huge thanks for all that you're doing. The last panelist we're going to bring on is another colleague here at the Natural Resources Agency, and that is Jacob Roper. Jacob leads communications for our Department of Conservation, which does a whole lot of things, including oversees fossil fuel in California and then transition away from fossil fuel. So Jacob, I would normally be talking to you about oil drilling permits or the moratoriums or this kind of thing, but I get to talk to you about this value that we share at the agency, and that is inclusion. So talk about yourself and your journey and how you came into state government, how you came into this job as a LGBTQ plus person, And then how does it inform the work that you do?
Thank you, Secretary. Thanks for your leadership. And I'm just a little taken back by listening to these stories today. Pride Month really is in full motion as I'm hearing these stories and seeing lots of faces and hearing lots of anecdotes that I think people need to hear this month. I grew up in the 90s in rural Placer County near the intersection of the North Fork and the Middle Fork of the American River. That's one of the tributaries that makes up the delta that Dylan manages. And we call that region the Divide. I know that's very Game of Thrones, but we like saying that. That's just our thing. I've got super deep roots there. 4 generations of my family went to the same high school. It's also very, very rural. I don't just mean we chopped our own firewood. We didn't have a sewer system. I mean, we didn't have cable, and you still can't get cable there today. I'm supposed to be up there today, but the bandwidth is not so great. I never actually lived in an incorporated city until I went to college. When I walked home from school, I didn't take a road. I cut through an apple orchard into a plum orchard, grabbing snacks on the way, and feeding animals. I got to spend a lot of time roaming through nature. There was no trail, there was no forest or abandoned mine that I couldn't turn into a playground. And I should say, please don't play in abandoned mines. That is not safe. I was really into the Goonies, and I really thought there was treasure, but spoiler alert, there is not. Stay out of abandoned mines. I have a lot to be grateful for. I mean, in that almost bucolic setting that I'm describing as a childhood, but it wasn't an easy place to grow up gay. I could never fit in as one of the guys. A perfect Sunday for my dad would be driving us deeper into the mountains to cut firewood. And it would be him and his friends, and they would just have a blast, and we would cut firewood until either the gasoline or the beer ran out. And most of the time, they were speaking a different language almost. I couldn't connect with their conversation. So after about an hour, my dad would normally lose me and then go and find me, and I'd be under a tree with a book reading, because that was what I was interested in. And that's the only way I knew how to engage. I grew up with a lot of people who had strong expectations about what a man should be able to do. I could fix computers, but when it came to fixing cars or machinery, I was useless. I was also the firstborn kid and the oldest grandchild in a 3-generation family business, and I just knew I didn't want this to be my life. There were queer people around, but it was very quiet and it was very discreet. And if you asked questions about it, you got in trouble fast. It was all on the down low, and there was a lot of bullying. We didn't really call it bullying back then, but there was a lot of violence, and it was enough for me to leave at age 18 without any intention of ever coming back. But I got lucky, because after I graduated college, I immediately landed a job in the state capitol, and that put me about 50 miles away from my home at all times. I can actually see my hometown from my office at CNRA headquarters today. And every time I visited my hometown, I could see changes. I could see more open discussion about LGBTQ people. Gay people were getting invited to events as couples, which was unheard of when I was a kid. In 2014, my dad passed away suddenly at the age of 57. And that rural community just heaped love on us. And at his service, every single one of those kids that bullied me in middle school or in high school was there. They were there with their family. They were there to shake my hand and ask if I or my mom needed anything. It really has come a long way, and I'm very proud of that region. I think that I was an outcast as a kid, not just because I was queer, but because I was different. We didn't have exposure to LGBTQ plus or two-spirit people, much less as leaders where I grew up. And today, an openly gay man is the head of the Chamber of Commerce in my hometown. In 2022, the Mosquito Ridge fire threatened my hometown, and burned most of the canyon side that I used to play in, and I know by heart. I'm super grateful for my colleagues and our team members at CAL FIRE who saved my hometown. They stopped that fire 4 blocks from my grandmother's house that my great-grandfather built with his bare hands. And here at the Department of Conservation, I got to be part of the response too, because we employ geologists who go and analyze fire scars. And they showed that that fire burned so hot that the soil actually became hydrophobic. It would no longer absorb water. And that meant that every drop of rain that hits the top of the mountain will make it to the bottom of the mountain. And that could include debris flow as well. So if I didn't do this work, and if I wasn't lucky enough to be a public servant, and I hadn't made peace with my hometown and become proud of it, I couldn't do the work that I'm doing, and I couldn't help communities like the one I grew up in become more climate resilient in the future. And that's a really important and proud part of my story. My wish for every LGBTQ plus or Two-Spirit Californian is that in a California for all, they can bloom where they're planted. And I'm really grateful to listen to a lot of the other panelists who are doing amazing work today, and are also showing queer kids who are growing up in today's environment that you can grow up, you can be a leader, and your story can matter.
That's amazing, Jacob. One thing I so deeply value about these conversations is you get to meet and know people in ways that it never did before. So thank you for sharing your story. What an incredible journey of courage and persistence, and such an optimistic story to share the growth of and evolution of your community. And I love that metaphor, help people bloom or grow where they're planted. And that's certainly the California for all that we're working to build across the state. So just huge thanks for bringing your authentic self to this conversation in such a meaningful way. I want to bring everybody back onto the screen here in the last 10 or so minutes. It's been such a powerful conversation and so many different stories, and yet so many connected dots. We've gotten great questions and observations, including a couple like really focused on one. Kay says, returning to the office, which we have a return to the office movement here in the state government. What can we do to make the building more welcoming to transgender people? And then another one, Ryan asked, can you share any advice on practical and immediate ways to create a safe space so employees do feel comfortable bringing themselves to the workplace? So maybe let me turn this into a question. So much of this is energizing and inspiring and optimism provoking because we're living in a place, generally speaking, that is supportive of this incredible diversity. But what do you want to see institutions do more of, or colleagues do more of? Let's challenge ourselves here. What do we want to redouble our commitment to doing, whether it's really specific practical things or organizational cultural suggestions? Caroline.
I'll jump in. So a couple things that come immediately to mind, and I'll give you credit, Wade. In my course of my career, once I moved from private sector over to public sector, it's agency here that is the first time I've seen the level of consistent focus on uplifting the stories of diversity and inclusion. I know it's something, I hear about it when you're leading me as my boss, that it's a focus area and you are spending time and energy on it. So that's a very specific, actionable thing that leaders at every level can work on, is how to actually have an intentional, conscious focus on it. So that's one. The other one I would say and that's more like organizational, right? Institutional. What I would say on more of just a personal, like, relationship part, it's also about in the environments, in the conversations, in the meetings, in the hallway conversations, in the dialogue that we all have for each other, for all of us, ally, participant, whatever role you bring to it, to speak up and to call attention to, all of our identities that need to be uplifted, because they have been historically marginalized. So I offer those two options: one an organizational option, and one more of what we can all personally do into our individual conversations.
Love it. Thank you.
I have one thought I could mention because it just stands out with when we made some changes at our local facility. We changed all of our bathrooms to be gender non-conforming labels, so it's not men, it's not women, it's kind of like the triangle with the circle. There's multiple different symbols that are used now. And some of the other leadership kind of was like, well, this is really expensive. It's costing us a lot of money. It's only a 5% portion of our community. Why are we spending the money on this? And one of the things I brought up, I said, well, are you aware that in our community locally in Sacramento, there's 3 different apps that you can download to your Android or iPhone that actually list safe spaces with bathrooms? Because people in the transgender community will often avoid certain places that don't have safe bathrooms because they do not want to be attacked. They might look more masculine one day, more feminine one day, and they're scared to actually go into certain buildings, and they actually can avoid services, healthcare, and others because there isn't that safe space for them. And so that was an easy, silent thing for our facility to do that made people be welcome and know that they are able to come in and get equitable care.
Powerful example. Thank you.
Can I just add too really quick? Visibility matters, but words matter a lot. And just being, I'm not saying everyone has to be politically correct all the time and like be just afraid to say anything at all because you're afraid to say the wrong thing. But you can always ask someone how they want to be referred to. And that goes a long way, and just trying to use more inclusive language. And I'm really on a crusade to get rid of the binary in documents too, but that's, yeah.
Yeah, and we should all be challenged on that. And I think great point. And I also think as it relates to providing an open and affirming place for transgender colleagues is, Dylan, it's this balance around, being respectful, but then also not shutting down, right? If you're somebody that hasn't met somebody who's transgender or has certain questions, sort of, since you brought it up, any way that allies or folks that want to be supportive, can strike that balance?
Well, I would just say when I was coming out, I expected that there would be a million questions directed at me, that people would come up and ask me questions. And I didn't get a single question because I think everyone, I don't know why, but I think err on the side of starting a discussion, and I know that I would initially be super forgiving for any, language mishap or whatever. Like, I don't care if you're trying, that's all that matters to me. So.
Huge thanks. I see Dr. Mendez took himself off mute, and then Jacob.
Oh, no, I would just piggyback on that. I think, first of all, I think the comments made leadership, having more inclusiveness around LGBTQ issues, particularly transgender issues, starts from above. And I applaud you, Secretary Crawford, for doing this. And it's a model for the rest of the appointees and elected officials throughout California. And then the second, I think what was just mentioned, is having a sense of patience and a little bit humility, understanding that you're not everyone has a bad intention. And I particularly speak that as a LGBT person of color, and trying to give people some space to ask these questions that it was mentioned, and try to assume that there is some good intention there, but obviously there is discrimination and people that are intentionally trying to misgender or degrade LGBTQ individuals. But again, it's just trying to have that open space to ask questions. And again, it starts with leadership, making that example that these conversations, these priorities, and highlighting LGBTQ communities is important.
So true. Jacob, I'm going to give you near the final word here.
Actually, I'm just propping up something that Dr. Gritty mentioned in the chat, which is adding pronouns to signatures is a silent but loud way to provide support for allies. I am a cisgender male. Nevertheless, I have never been misgendered in my life, but I still put my pronouns out there because I want to show people that I'm thinking about how to respectfully address others and keep the conversation going.
That's great. And that really speaks to the request for practical, immediate things that we can all do. Well, listen, huge thanks. I'm deeply inspired by this discussion. And I think it's just a perfect conversation to be having as we celebrate Pride and challenge ourselves to really help our workplaces, our communities actually embody the values that we have. So big thanks to each of you for being leaders, for sharing your story, sharing your journey. For all of us who are joining us here today, it's only the 6th month or 6th day of June, and Pride is celebrated all month. And of course, this work happens all year, but there's great opportunities to celebrate and to be vocal, be visible. Whether you're in Sacramento, join us at the Pride Parade this weekend. We'll actually have a HR recruiting booth. If you are thinking about maybe coming and joining us, come meet our HR recruiters at the festival after the parade. There are all sorts of events happening across California communities, and we look forward to you stepping up and joining and being part of this incredible community across California. So thanks, everybody. I think we have one last slide that we usually put, which is just an opportunity to provide us feedback on the discussion. If you have any questions or requests on this discussion, please hit us up at this email. If you have suggestions for ways we can follow up on anything we talked about here today, we welcome that, as well as any other suggestions you have for other topics for our dialogues here at the Secretary Speaker Series. Have a great day, have a great week, and once again, happy Pride.